Imagine waking up in total velvet-lined darkness. Not the darkness of a closed eyelid, not the darkness of a midnight room. A darkness with weight to it. A darkness that presses. The first thing you notice is the smell. Damp, mineral, cold. Fresh earth pressing in from every side. The second thing you notice is that you cannot sit up. You reach out, slowly, because your limbs feel borrowed, unfamiliar, and your fingers meet a lid. Wood, smooth, only inches from your face. You are underground. You are as far as anyone standing 6 feet above you is concerned, dead. In the Victorian era, this was not a nightmare conjured by candlelight and too much laudanum. For a startling number of people, it was considered a plausible, documented, terrifying possibility. A fear so widespread, it had a name: taphophobia, the fear of being buried alive. And it was a fear so serious, so deeply embedded in the culture of the 1800s, that it gave birth to an entire category of invention: the safety coffin, a wooden box built not to contain the dead, but to give the almost dead one last chance to ring a bell. Tonight, we're descending into that history. Settle in, let the dark do what it does, and listen closely, because somewhere, underneath all of this, a bell is still swinging on its wire. Welcome to another Society Lecture. At the center of this sphere sat a simple piece of hardware, a brass bell mounted just above ground level, connected by a thin cord, sometimes called a lifeline, that ran down through a hollow tube, through the coffin lid, and into the hand of the person lying inside. The idea was almost tender in its simplicity. If you woke, if your eyes opened onto that black, airless silence, all you had to do was pull the string. The bell above would ring. A watchman, hired specifically for this purpose, would hear it and dig. That was the entire plan. A string, a bell, and the hope that someone was listening. It sounds almost quaint now, but to a Victorian family standing at a fresh grave, it wasn't quaint at all. It was the only thing standing between their loved one and a slow, silent suffocation in the dark. A death not caused by illness, but by misdiagnosis. Because here is the uncomfortable truth this whole era was built on. Doctors in the 1800s often could not tell the difference between a body that had died and a body that had simply, deeply stopped. To understand why an entire society became obsessed with bells and breathing tubes, you have to understand how little the science of the time actually knew about the line between life and death. There was no stethoscope refined enough to catch a faint heartbeat, no machine to measure brain activity, no blood test, no monitor, no soft beeping line to confirm that a body had, in fact, stopped. Instead, physicians relied on signs: stillness, cold skin, the absence of a pulse they could feel with their own fingertips. And these signs, it turns out, could be catastrophically wrong. Certain conditions, deep comas, catalepsy, severe hypothermia, some forms of poisoning, even extreme cases of illnesses like cholera, could slow the body down to something that looked, convincingly, like death. Breath so shallow, it fogged no mirror. A pulse so faint, it hid from untrained hands. So doctors developed tests, and some of them were almost gentle, holding a mirror to the lips, watching for the faintest mist of breath. Others were far from it, There are records of physicians pulling on the tongue with metal forceps, hard enough to cause pain in a living patient, because pain was proof of life. There are records of hot irons pressed to the skin, of needles driven under fingernails, all in pursuit of a single flinch, a single sign that somebody was still home, behind the eyes. And still, even with these methods, mistakes happened. Or at least, people were desperately afraid they did. Because once that fear takes root, once a culture starts to believe that death itself is not reliably detectable, it doesn't stay a medical concern. It becomes something deeper, a quiet dread that follows people to their own bedsides at night. It becomes taphophobia. And by the mid-1800s, it had settled into the Victorian imagination, like a fog that never quite lifted. Fear, when it's specific enough, tends to produce inventors, and the 1800s produced no shortage of them. Coffin patents from this era read like something out of a strange, sorrowful catalogue. Some designs included a simple breathing tube, a pipe running from the coffin's interior up through the soil to the surface, allowing air to circulate in case the occupant was, in fact, still breathing. Others went further. Small glass panels were set into the coffin lid so that a watchman doing his rounds could peer down through the earth-level window and check the face of the deceased for any change, any flush of color, any twitch, any sign that stillness had become something else. Some designs used elaborate systems of springs and levers. The slightest movement of the chest, even a single shallow breath, could trigger a flag to rise above the grave or set a bell ringing on its own, without the occupant needing to lift a finger. One of the most famous of these was the Bateson revival device. Patented in the 1850s, it combined the bell, the cord, and an iron bar that fit through a tube directly into the coffin, so that even the smallest hand movement could set the mechanism ringing. Its inventor, George Bateson, reportedly built his fortune on this exact fear, and, as certain accounts of the time tell it, later took his own life, having grown convinced that nothing could ever fully guarantee that a soul was truly, permanently gone. But not every response to this fear involved machinery. In parts of Germany, entire buildings were constructed for the sole purpose of waiting. These were called Leichenhäuser, dead houses, mortuary halls, where bodies were laid out, dressed, sometimes fitted with bells and strings of their own, and simply watched. Attendants monitored the rooms around the clock, checking for the telltale signs of decomposition, the only proof, in the end, that death had truly arrived. Only once decay began would a body be considered safe to bury. Think about what that means. An entire profession existed, quiet men and women sitting through candlelit nights, whose job was to watch corpses for the earliest signs of rot, because rot was the only evidence anyone fully trusted. It's easy to look at all of this now, the bells, the tubes, the glass windows, the waiting halls, and see quaint Victorian eccentricity. But underneath the brass fittings and patent diagrams was something much heavier, a society trying desperately to engineer its way out of its own deepest fear. Of course, no fear this large survives on medical anxiety alone. It needs stories, and the 1800s provided plenty. Newspapers of the era were hungry for exactly this kind of tale, and they printed them freely. Accounts of coffins exhumed for other reasons, only to reveal the lid scratched from the inside. Bodies found turned, twisted, hands raised, as if in a final, useless struggle against the wood above them. Some of these accounts were investigated by physicians and dismissed. The movement of a decomposing body can, grimly, mimic the appearance of struggle, as gases and natural processes shift limbs long after death has truly occurred. Coffins can also settle, shift, and crack from the pressure of the earth above them in ways that can be misread as a desperate exit attempt. But separating panic from fact was never really the point of these stories. What mattered was that they spread, passed along at dinner tables, printed in penny papers, whispered at wakes. Each retelling added a little more certainty to something that was, in truth, exceedingly rare. And so, the phrase we still use today, "saved by the bell," was born from this exact anxiety. Whether it began with these coffin chords or elsewhere is still debated by historians, but its meaning was unmistakable to anyone living through this era. A narrow, ringing escape from a fate almost too horrible to name. The folklore outpaced the reality by a wide margin. Documented cases of true premature burial were vanishingly uncommon. But fear, as it so often does, was never especially interested in the statistics. It's worth sitting with that for a moment. Why does this particular fear still find us more than a century later? Perhaps because it isn't really about death at all. It's about helplessness, about being aware and unable to be heard, about the horror of a world that has already decided something about you, is finished with you, while you are still, quietly, there. That fear doesn't need a bell to survive. It just needs a body, and a box, and the dark. Eventually, medicine caught up to the fear, slowly, imperfectly, but enough. As diagnostic tools improved, better instruments for detecting a pulse, a clearer understanding of comas and cataleptic states, and eventually the practice of embalming, the terror of premature burial began, gradually, to loosen its grip. Embalming, in particular, changed everything. A body that has been embalmed cannot wake up. The very process that modern funeral homes now perform, as a matter of course, was, in part, the quiet, chemical end of centuries of dread. Combined with legal waiting periods before burial and later refrigeration, the physical possibility that haunted the Victorians was closed off almost entirely. But the fear itself never really died. It just changed shape. It moved from coffins into stories. Edgar Allan Poe, writing in the very heart of this era, returned to premature burial again and again, in tales of walled-up victims, of bodies interred too soon, of narrators who wake to realize, with mounting horror, exactly where they are. Poe didn't invent the fear. He simply gave it a voice, and readers recognized it immediately, because so many of them already carried a version of it themselves. That voice never really left. It runs through Gothic literature, through early horror cinema, through the modern taste for stories about waking up somewhere you shouldn't be, sealed in, buried, forgotten, and utterly alone. The safety coffin may have vanished from funeral catalogues, but its fear became a genre. Somewhere in the 1800s, a family stood at a fresh grave, pressed a small brass bell into the earth, and walked away, carrying with them the fragile hope that if they were wrong, if the doctors were wrong, if death had come too early to its verdict, someone would hear the ringing in time. Most of those bells never rang, but they were built anyway, because the line between sleep and death, to the people who lived through that era, never felt as certain as we tell ourselves it is now. Maybe that's the real legacy of the safety coffin, not the bell or the tube or the glass window in the lid, but the quiet admission underneath all of it that we have never been entirely sure where life ends. And somewhere, if you listen closely enough, in the space between sleep and whatever comes after, a bell is still swinging on its wire. Thank you for attending tonight's society lecture. If you enjoyed exploring history's darker corners, consider joining us again next Tuesday for another forgotten tale from the archives. Until then, keep questioning the past and never assume the silence means the story is over. Good night.